Good morning and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm Edna Friedberg, historian at the museum, and this morning I'm stepping in for my colleague, Lisa Leff. Our museum remains closed, but learning about the history of the Holocaust and its relevance today doesn't have to stop. So we're coming to you today from our homes as part of a Stay Connected Facebook Live series. We thank you in advance for your patience if we experience any technical difficulties while running the program this way. This week, we marked a very sad anniversary, the one-year anniversary of a deadly attack on a synagogue in Poway, California. And in memory and tribute to the victims of that attack, today we will be examining increases in anti-Semitic speech and violence over the last few years and the impact of the current pandemic on anti-Semitism, both in the United States and around the world. I can't think of anyone better to have this conversation with and to invite into my living room and me into hers, than professor and author Deborah Lipstadt. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Edna.
Deborah is currently the museum's Ina Levine Invitational Scholar, and our program today is in lieu of what would have been the Levine Lecture this evening. Deborah is perhaps best known for successfully defending herself against a Holocaust denier who had accused her of libel. She wrote a book about that, and that was made into a 2016 Hollywood film called Denial. I highly recommend Denial to our viewers. Deborah is also the author of quite a few books, including her most recent, Antisemitism, Here and Now. And during today's show, please send your comments for Deborah by posting them in the comments section. Send your questions for Deborah by posting them in the comments section. We'll get to as many of them as we can live during the show. Deborah, let's start with some of the basics. Could you please define anti-Semitism, what it is, as you do in your new book?
Okay, first of all, let me start with something else, Edna, and the spelling, because that'll be implicit in the definition, something which of course you know well. I spell it without a hyphen. Why do I spell it without a hyphen? Because anti-Semitism is not hatred of Semitism or Semites. There really questionably is something as Semites. They're people who speak Semitic languages. But anti-Semitism is Jew hatred. And for that, we need a little history. In the late 19th century, there was a journalist, a far right-wing nationalist journalist, Wilhelm Marr, in Vienna. And he felt that all the problems Vienna was facing were a result of Jews, an influx of Jews in Vienna. And two of the most prominent residents of Vienna at that time were Theodor Herzl, founder of Zionism, and Sigmund Freud, founder, of course, of psychotherapy. But he felt that Jews were all to blame, and he began to write rants against Jews. But he wanted a word that the useful word, or the most common word at that point was in German, Judenhass, hatred of Jews, Juden. But Marr wanted a more all-encompassing word, a word that would include Jews who were no longer practicing the religion, Jews who might even have converted, because he also was influenced by the idea that it was in your blood kind of thing. So he chose the word antisemitismus, anti-Semitism, because it meant all Jews. It wasn't against other groups. It wasn't other groups that spoke Semitic languages. It was all Jews. He didn't invent the word, but he certainly popularized it. A footnote to that is on his deathbed, a couple of decades later, he decided that the problems he had been addressing were really a result of the Industrial Revolution and not of Jews. But by then, as we like to say, the train had left the station or the horse had left the barn and the problem was out there. So anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews. It's not based on something Jews do. And Jews can do terrible things just like any other group of people. Individuals within a group can do terrible things. But it's ascribing to all Jews intrinsic, inherent, if not genetic, kinds of characteristics or negative characteristics. So let me just add one more point. I know this is a long answer, but I think you're right to start with it because it really frames it. Anti-Semitism is a stereotype, like racism, sexism, homophobia, fear of other ethnic groups, whatever it might be. It's a stereotype like those other stereotypes. But each stereotype, for a stereotype to be effective, it's got to have a number of familiar traits associated with it, so that when you hear it, it makes sense to the listener. The racist, and I'm emphasizing now, the racist stereotypes associated in this country horrifically with African Americans have often been words like shiftless, lazy, welfare cheats, which have been used, people, you hear them used by certain people, you know, hey, that's a code word for African Americans, that person is engaging in that kinds of stereotyping. What are the stereotypes for Jews, for anti-Semitism? There are essentially 4 of them. Something to do with money, something to do with smarts, but not positive smarts, not affirmative smarts, malicious smarts, nefarious smarts, clever, cunning, crafty. You know, I'm not sure if they all begin with C's has anything to do with it, but that kind of thing, so that you hear it, you say, oh, those Jews, they know how to operate, kind of thing. The third element is punching above their weight. Small number, these are all, of course, interrelated, small number, but ability to manipulate, ability to control, even though they are small in number. And the fourth one is, and this goes out of Christian theology. In fact, the last time I discussed this was on the stage of the Meyerhoff Auditorium in the museum. Excuse me, background noises. In the museum, in a previous panel, but demonization, devil, and this comes out of Christian anti-Semitism, but of course moves outside of Christian anti-Semitism, in the fact that one of the characteristics of the devil is that he does his handiwork without your knowing that he was there. He comes in disguise. So the Jew comes in disguise, or the Jew is behind the group doing evil. So that's you've got those 4 things as a stereotype: hatred of Jews. And the last point I want to make, and then I'll stop with this answer, but I'm sure there may be more on it. Anti-Semitism is not related to what Jews do. And as I said earlier, Jews can do bad things just like anybody else can do bad things. But if a Jew, or even a group of Jews, does a bad thing, hate that group, be angry at that group, show hostility towards that group. But the minute you go outside that group and encompass everyone, then you're teetering on anti-Semitism.
And you've touched on many, many things, but with that part that it's about who people are rather than what they do, you've touched on a pet peeve of mine, which is in relation to the Holocaust, when people refer to the 6 million murdered Jews during the Holocaust as martyrs. They didn't die in defense of a belief, and many of them, in fact, were atheists or anti-religious.
Or were Christians. There were churches, as you well know, there were churches within the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. When we all can travel again, and people go to Poland, to Warsaw, you will see a massive church which was inside the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto.
Well, Deborah, you could not have known, because you are not seeing the comments that are coming up on my screen. But in fact, I was about to thank a viewer who is joining us today from Warsaw. So we hope to come there again soon to visit some of these historical sites. I'd also like to acknowledge viewers who are watching us this morning live from Tennessee, from Berlin, the capital of Germany, from New York, and from Toronto. So we are really glad to have all of you here today. Deborah, anti-Semitism in all of its manifest forms you just described does not only affect Jewish people. What is the impact that it has on society as a whole?
See, I think that's such an important point, and I'm glad to raise it right at the outset. Anti-Semitism is a danger. Certainly it's a danger to Jews, just like, as I mentioned, racism before. Racism is a danger to people of color, African Americans, Latinos, etc. But no healthy society, healthy democratic society, has harbored anti-Semitism and remained a healthy democratic society. That when you have anti-Semitism within a society, First of all, it means that people are subscribing to a conspiracy theory. And implicit in my comments earlier, maybe I should make this explicit then, but I'll make it explicit now, that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. You know, again, with most prejudicial stereotypes, especially related to ethnicity, racism, you're punching down. If that group moves into our neighborhood, they're going to bring down the neighborhood. If their kids go to our kids' school, they're going to bring down the schools. That was the busing, you know, supposedly the hostility towards busing decades ago, and other things like that. You're punching down. You don't want them to bring you down. The anti-Semite, who is often the racist, just another, you know, aspect or side of the racist, is punching up. The Jews, if they get into, if the Jew is not just to be loathed, but to be feared. So part of the conspiracy, so going back to your question of the bigger danger of the anti-Semitism, is that anybody who subscribes to anti-Semitism is already having doubts, well, can I trust the government? The Jews are behind it on some of these anti-Semitic websites, which I know you have visited and I have visited, and I don't suggest to our viewers that they visit because they're just horrific. They talk about the ZOG, the Zionist Occupation Government. In other words, Jews are running the government. So anti-Semitism—
Running the government here, to be clear.
Government here, it can be used in other places too, but
not Israel.
No, they're not talking about Israel. In Israel, it is a Zionist occupation government, our Zionist government, because it's a Zionist state. But they're talking exactly outside of Israel, that the Jews are running things, or the Jews are running the press, or the Jews are controlling the banks, or the Jews are the lawyers, the Jews are the judges. So when you ask the question about what's the bigger danger of anti-Semitism, you're talking about sowing distrust in the fundamental institutions of society. And if people don't trust the fairness of fundamental institutions, that's not to say these institutions can't have things that are unfair or do things that are unfair, absolutely. But if you believe they are fundamentally unfair in their foundation stone, then you don't trust in the democracy, and all of democracy is threatened.
So Deborah, I'd like to jump to today. And specifically against this long, complicated, sometimes contradictory backdrop of anti-Semitic views and conspiracy theories. What is new? What is different now during this coronavirus pandemic?
Well, let me step back even before the coronavirus. We're seeing anti-Semitism, we've seen it in the past from the right, and we've seen it from the left. Today, we're seeing it simultaneously from both sides. There are new things and there are not so new things. Of course, the coronavirus epidemic is to a great degree a new thing. People are seeing now on their screens recent. This is in the past, I don't know, few weeks. April
9th, I'm going to interrupt a second to say this is April 9th. This is graffiti that was sprayed onto to deface a synagogue in Huntsville, Alabama.
Okay, there you go. Huntsville, Alabama, home of a NASA facility. Not that a backwater is going to be any more anti-Semitic than another place. But in other words, this is a lot of sophisticated people in this community, and some people went out and did this. And notice the hatred, and then the connection to Nazism, Gaza Mall. Now, I'll tell you the irony with some of this graffiti. If we found the people who put up this graffiti and asked them if the Holocaust really happened, they tell you it was a myth. Yet they're saying gas the mall. I mean, it's. I'm not seeing humor in it, but at some point you got to laugh at their idiocy, but they're dangerous too, and the white power. What we're seeing today, it's not so new, and I wouldn't say it was new. Of course, the pandemic is new. This coronavirus is new. But it's often been the case. Think about it. You're a historian. You know this. Back to the Black Plague of the Middle Ages, or London in the 17th century. Okay, now we're seeing exacta. Thank you very much, whoever put that up. That's great. These are middle woodcuts and examples of some from the Middle Ages, some I think a little more recent, but the Jew associated with typhus, the Jew associated with poisoning the wells, the Jew associated with spreading disease. That was a very common accusation against the Jew. And go back to the stereotypes that I mentioned earlier. It's part of that stereotype. Remember, the devil comes and does his work, and you don't know you've been impacted by the devil till he's come and gone. Well, the Jew has come and poisoned the wells. The Jew has come and spread the virus. The Jew has come and brought the Black Plague. And you don't know that it's happened till the damage has come. So in some of the demonstrations that we've seen the past few weeks in various state capitals, irrespective of how you feel, whether the economy should be wide open or closed, that's immaterial. What's striking is the allusions you've seen, the anti-Semitic connections in the one in Columbus, the Ohio state capitol. There was an overt a Nazi-related, Jew-related placard. In Michigan, what did they call Governor Hitmeyer, or something like that, and a caricature of Hitler. Those are all to click in the minds of some of the people who might be attracted to something like this, the Jew. In other words, we don't have to say the Jew did it, but we're making that connection. And that's how stereotypes works, because that's why they're so powerful. Because you just have to make the suggestion and the mind goes to the stereotype.
And it's similar to what you were mentioning earlier about racist stereotypes about African Americans, that you don't say the name, but they're coded. They're sort of dog whistles or signals. Right. That people have that frame of reference.
Right. There's certain words that are code words, that gangs, there's a gang in my neighborhood. Oh, here we go. This is, I don't know, which one is this? This is the Ohio one. Here we go.
Columbus, you mentioned.
This is exactly the one I was talking about.
So the real play, not only is he a rat, but he's wearing a kippah, a Jewish skull cap.
That's right. Who's the real plague? You don't have to say Jew. First of all, the Jewish star, so that makes it clear. And with the kippah, and notice that the blue stripe, that's Israel. And the star in the middle is the Israeli flag. So this whole thing is superimposed on the Israeli flag. And again, as you well know, and then many of people watching probably know, the famous documentary produced by Goebbels in 1940, The Eternal Jew. There's a famous scene in it where they lift, they're talking about the danger of the Jew, and they lift a big sack of rice or flour or something, and the rats scurry out from underneath.
Actually, Deborah, we can show the clip. You don't.
Okay, there we go.
So let's jump to that clip from this 1940 propaganda film.
You have it prepared. This is very good.
Your Ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, so people can see.
Eine verblüffende Parallele zu dieser jüdischen Wanderung durch die ganze Welt bieten uns die Massenwanderungen eines ebenso ruhelosen Tieres, der Ratte. Wo Ratten auch auftauchen, tragen sie Vernichtung ins Land, zerstören sie menschliche Güter und Nahrungsmittel. Auf diese Weise verbreiten sie Krankheiten, Pest, Lepra, Typhus, Cholera, Ruhr und so weiter. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen. Wir sehen nicht mehr wie 1914 bloß das Groteske und Komische an diesen fragwürdigen Gestalten des Ghettos. Wir erkennen, dass hier ein Pestherd liegt, der die Gesundheit der arischen Völker bedroht. Ein Volk von Parasiten.
Yep. You just take that and you translate that into 2020 and you've got exactly the same thing. So what's new is that we're seeing it today in connection to the pandemic. What's not new is that it's a continuation. And that, of course, again, goes back to my comment about stereotype. Were they to say that the Jews have done all this because they're lazy That's the wrong stereotype. That's a racist stereotype, and certainly in the United States, associated with shiftless and lazy with African Americans, often used, you know, in racist, and has been used over centuries in that regard. But with the Jew, you say scurrying, you know, hiding. Again, and it goes back again to my comment about the fourth characteristic. I said, you don't know that they've been there till you lift the sack of wheat or whatever it is, and there they are, and then they scurry out and do their damage.
And I'm struck also, just to add another historical layer to this for viewers, the footage that they showed there that showed kind of stereotypical images of Jews in ghettos doing dirty things. You know, this guy picking his nose, yes. It just seemed unclean. The Nazis explicitly used this kind of stereotype as an excuse, as a justification for why Jews needed to be contained and quarantined, sealed off from the wider society in ghettos. And we have a number of artifacts in our collection that show signs warning non-Jews to stay away from ghettos because they are disease zones. And in fact, the irony is that they were a self-fulfilling prophecy by taking tens and tens of thousands of human beings and locking them up in enclosed places without sanitation or medical care or food. They became disease vectors.
That's right.
We're here. Deborah, can you unpack what we're looking at? This is a brand new meme from online from now.
This is exactly it. This is the Jew. Look at the face. This is, if you were to look at the opening or the logo for the Eternal Jew, the clip we just saw, it's a similar kind of face. The large nose, the kippah, the yarmulke, the head covering, the yarmulke on it. Stealthy. There's something stealthy by how they move. Here they come. And above all, notice the smile. It's not just a diabolical smile, something you expect from the Joker in Batman, I think it is. But they're doing damage to others for their own good, for their own benefit. Somehow the Jew has an interest in this. And that's part of it also. You know, and you may be heading to ask this question, but I'll jump in with this at this point. As our viewers know, and so many people watching know, from the introduction, so much of my work has been about Holocaust denial. And if you were to ask a denier, I mean, denial is a ludicrous thing. The fact that it gets any traction at all, even amongst anti-Semites, boggles the mind. Because, and as I know you know, Ed and I did a TED Talk on this, which has gotten a lot of attention. But I begin by saying, for deniers to be right, who has to be wrong? The thousands, tens of thousands of documents, copies of many of which are in the museum archives or on it online. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. Other genocides are well documented, the Armenian, but this went on much longer, and the Germans had a penchant for documentation. But who else would have to be wrong? Certainly all the survivors, certainly the bystanders, the thousands of historians of which we are just two all over the world would have to be in on the hoax or have been duped. The perpetrators, you know, the people who did it, the Germans, the other countries, etc. So you have to ask the question, how do you make sense? How do you explain to someone that the Jews did this if you have all this evidence against it? And so you lie about the documents, you lie about the evidence. This month is exactly 20 years to the verdict in my trial. You lie about all the stuff we showed the court. But then the question comes up. A person who was, let's say, tabula rasa about the Holocaust, who didn't recognize the idiocy of this, would say, well, what's in it for the Jews to have made up this story? What do they get out of it? I mean, to go to this effort to build museums, to do all these things. And what the denier would answer, and if you went on any denial site, again, I don't recommend this. Don't try this at home. You know, you would see that the justification, the rationalization they give for the Jew doing this, they ask is, what did the Jews, and I put this in very big quotation marks, get out of the Holocaust? Well, the answer is two things. One of which is not quite historically correct, and one is undeniably historically correct. The one that's not quite historically correct is the State of Israel. The State of Israel, there would have been some political entity in that part of the world, a Jewish controlled, Jewish administered entity. But, and if it had been a direct result of the Holocaust, it would have been established in 45, 46, 47, not till 48. But the general impression amongst many people is that the Holocaust is a outgrowth or a result of I'm sorry, the State of Israel is a result of the Holocaust. And what's the other thing? Reparations. Reparations, of course, being a fancy word for money. And so you've given a rationale to the person who is hearing about Holocaust denial that makes sense to them because it fits into the anti-Semitic stereotype. The Jews, for their own good, made the Germans carry this burden of this terrible genocide of which they were not guilty, says the denier, and made the Germans pay all this money. With the Jews, it always has to do with money. And they took over a land not their own and didn't care if they dispersed, other people. Here again, you see exactly that kind of thing for their own good. So even though denial it's ludicrous, it's like the flat earth theory of history. It's like denying gravity, You can debate many things about the Holocaust, and we do that within the walls of the museum and beyond, of course, on these kind of things, how it started, who was involved, how it could have been, might it have been stopped, where did the power come from, all sorts of things. But not that it happened. So how is it possible? It's only possible because it fits into this pre-existing stereotype.
So I want to acknowledge we have viewers watching us from around the world, tuning in from England, watching from Holocaust organizations, many of our partner and sister groups all over the country and internationally. We have viewers from Australia. Welcome, it is not morning for you, from Nebraska, from Florida. I'd like to tie some of this together, Deborah. You talked about the enduring stereotype of Jews as greedy, as profiteers. And then we just saw this meme in which Jews are quite literally embedded into this virus. How has this profiting, greedy Jew stereotype morphed during the pandemic? What are the allegations?
How is it, pardon? How is
it morphed during this pandemic? What are the allegations?
The thing with the stereotype, and again, I keep repeating this because it's so important to get it, is that it draws on morphine is actually the right word. You take it and you go with it. We haven't fully seen it play out yet, but here we go. The Jew coming in secret. Here comes the coronavirus, but this is a way of the Jew getting control of the world. Let me in, put down your guardrails, I'm coming in. Somehow, it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to make sense at all because fear doesn't make sense. Hatred doesn't make sense. Prejudice, think about the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge, these are not facts, but you play on the fears. So here's exactly what you get. Clean cut, people taking precautions with masks. Here comes the virus. Who's behind the virus? The Jew.
And how are Jews allegedly making money off the virus?
How are they? Well, big pharma. You can rest assured that they will find connections, Jews connections to big pharma. Banks will be making money, even though some banks are being harmed. And it's just, it doesn't have to make sense, but they'll all be there. The standard ones will be there. That this is a way of the Jew getting control.
One of the things that I've noticed that really struck me as just particularly nasty as an accusation is the idea that somehow this is a long Jewish plot, a long view Jewish plot, that you mentioned pharma or other biomedical companies have in some way been developing a vaccine, that Jews have developed a vaccine and are just holding it in reserve so that they can sell it at a higher profit.
That's right. In fact, there was a tweet, a pretty prominent actress who tweeted, I'm not going to mention her name, early on when it was announced that Israel was working on a vaccine. And she tweeted something to the effect, and the sociologist David Hirsch in England pointed this out, and he was so right. Israel has a vaccine already. I'm paraphrasing, but it was very short, but that, you know, most powerful tweets often are. What was the implication? Israel knew this was coming. Now, of course, when Oxford announced a couple of days ago that we are we're in a preparation, we're about to start testing a vaccine, no one said, hey, how come Oxford knew? Or when American companies know, if you said, how come that company knew? Or how come Oxford knew? Because the scientists were working on other coronaviruses. They've been working on coronaviruses for a decade, so they were prepared to go with this. It's again, you know, but when you say it's about the Jew, it has diabolical implications.
Sorry, Deborah, to interrupt, but I've known you long enough. I feel I can interrupt. I just want
to. Anybody can interrupt me. I just keep going anyways.
I want to make sure that viewers don't get the false impression that this is just kind of an extreme marginal crackpot theory when you're talking about Israel supposedly knowing things about the virus. We have seen from the highest levels of the Iranian government, for example, explicit accusations that both the state of Israel and the United States have created coronavirus supposedly as a bioweapon, as a biological attack against Iran. So this has currency and traction.
You're so right, and thank you for interrupting, because that's exactly right. The bioweapon, that's a new gloss on an old stereotype. So in the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, you know, the great deaths in different times, etc. Typhus, the Jew is the spreader of disease. Now it's the bioweapon, and that makes, in a way, that's even more. They not only are spreading, they're not only spreaders of disease, as we saw in the clip from the German propaganda film, from the Goebbels propaganda film, but they're weaponizing. Takes it up to a higher and more explicit level.
Deborah, I want to acknowledge we are getting many, many questions from viewers, and we're going to run longer if we need to, because I want to be able to pose some of them to you. One viewer has asked and said, maybe we can't stop anti-Semitism, but how can we respond when we see it on social media, and how can we make it unacceptable? Thoughts on that?
That's such a good question. I think the viewer is right. We can't, it's very hard to stop it. There was a historian who passed away a couple of years ago in the Hebrew University, Robert Wistridge, who wrote a book. What is it, The Longest Hatred or The Oldest Hatred? Longest.
I think The Longest Hatred.
Yeah, The Longest Hatred. And it's true. It is the longest hatred. It has its roots in the New Testament. And I'm not saying that the New Testament essentially was a conversation amongst Jews. You know, it was different groups of Jews debating with each other about how religion should evolve, etc. But what happened 200 years later, 300 years later, is that material was used, particularly in Europe, starting mainly in Europe and then spreading, of course, as a way of arguing for the supremacy, the superiority of Christianity over Judaism. And as a way of building up Christianity, you put down the Jew. And of course, it spread way beyond the confines of the church. It spread certainly to Martin Luther, to Protestantism. It spread to Nazism. It spread to pseudoscience. So I'm not, you know, just saying that it was there. But one of the difficult thing is here. COVID-19 blamed on Jews not following Jesus. Rick Wiles, that's right, about 2 weeks ago.
And who is Rick Wiles, for people who don't know him?
He's a fundamentalist minister who is quite right-wing, who has made these kind of statements before. But of course, when you anti-Semitic statements, Jews, whatever happens to Jews, bad thing happened to Jews. If only they believed in Jesus, everything would be solved. And that sort of also justifies it. You don't believe in Jesus, it's okay to go after you. But to go back to that question that one of the viewers asked, so it's a very hard thing to wipe out. And on social media, it's often a judgment call. Sometimes you've got to ignore it because, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, did it make a sound? The worst thing I get when I post things on, or when I tweet about things or post things on Facebook, I'm old, so I'm still on Facebook. No, we're all on Facebook. We're not all old. But,
I'm old to be, and I'm on Facebook too. My
yes,
kids are.
exactly. But I do tweet, and I get these anti-Semitic comments. I know they're begging for an answer. Most of the time, I just ignore them. Often, I don't even see them, and people will call them to my attention. And I say I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of responding. But sometimes they have to be responded to. So this comment about Israel with the vaccines, my response would have been Oxford ? United States and the companies in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. Are they all in it as well? Sometimes you've got to respond with the facts. Now, here's the difficult thing with anti-Semitism. As with any form of prejudicial stereotyping, it's irrational. I remind viewers again, going back to my comment about, or my parsing of the word prejudice, prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I know already. So you're dealing with something irrational. If I see a Jew and I say, oh, that person is a crook, I know they're a crook because they're a Jew. Or I see a African American, I make a stereotype because I know they're whatever, you know. Former Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, once told an anecdote. I was in a talk I heard him give, or an interview, where he was, I think he was already a federal attorney, and he had gone home, changed his clothes into his sweats or his running stuff, and was going to a movie with friends, and he was late. So he was running, I think it was through Georgetown. He was running through some part of Washington to get to the movie, and the police stopped him because he was a Black man running through a predominantly white area. You know, so it's that, again, not all police are like that, but there's that stereotypical thinking. I'm willing to believe things about certain people because I've been so exposed to it. It's so deep in the soil. So I think sometimes you respond and sometimes you don't. But it also calls, and I want to say this strongly for viewers who have tuned in now, especially those tuned in at this early hour or wherever, the late hour. I think Australia, I don't know what time it is in Australia. Whenever I get confused, I go to Australia, I get confused and think that's going to be one of those trips is long time off. That it's very important to understand that you're dealing with something irrational. So the minute you give a rational answer, you're sort of falling into the person who's spreading the myths trap. In other words, if someone were to say to me, well, I'll give you an example of something that happened to me once in a classroom years ago. I was teaching a course on films of the Holocaust. And I was co-teaching it with a film specialist. And the way the course was structured, I would lecture on a topic. It was Tuesday and Thursdays. I would lecture on the history of a topic. And then on Wednesday night, the class would go and see a film related. And then on Thursday, the film specialist would do the analysis. And it was a lecture course. So we agreed, my co-teacher and I agreed that it wasn't a seminar where you just sat around and had a conversation. You could easily interrupt, as we are wont to do, you know. We agreed that as each person lectured, they would stop every few minutes, and turn to the other person and say, do you have anything you want to add? We wouldn't interrupt each other because it's hard when you interrupt the lecture. It's disconcerting. So it was early in the course, and we were seeing The Eternal Jew, we were seeing Yud Zeus, the other famous 1940 propaganda film, which was a great hit throughout Europe, and others, seeing Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, and other German propaganda films, and talking about propaganda, and then specifically about anti-Semitic propaganda. And a student raised her hand. Now, this was a class that was hard to get into. It was a very popular class. It was at 8:30 in the morning. You know, most university students don't know that there are classes at 8:30, much less sign up to attend them. So you had to want to be there. And a student raised her hand as I was talking about the nature of German, it's early in the course, nature of German anti-Semitic propaganda. And she said, but weren't all the banks in Germany controlled by Jews, and weren't all the lawyers Jews? And I was taken aback by this, and I began to answer her with facts. I said, no, there was this bank that was a major German bank that wasn't controlled by Jews, and there was this bank, and there was this bank, and I began to say there were fewer than 600,000 Jews in Germany when the Nazis came to power, of whom, you know, so many were children and so many were women, so that left so many, and there were so many lawyers, and giving all sorts, just a fact dump, dumping her with fact after fact after fact. And my co-teacher, who happened to be from a Philadelphia Italian Catholic background. She had been a nun, a sister for many years before she left the order, etc. She stepped forward, and contrary to what we had decided, she interrupted me, and she said, she looked at the student and she said, "So what?" That was the right answer. I had fallen into, in other words, so what? So what if they didn't know the judges? What if they could, is that a reason to automatically despise them? The banks, you need a loan, you go to the bank. You need a mortgage, you go to the bank. You need some place to save your money, you go to the banks. Banks aren't inherently evil. You're in trouble with the law, you need a lawyer. You want to incorporate a business, you need a lawyer. You know, they're fundamental, and they're good ones and they're bad ones. Her answer was the right answer. She was pulling the ground out from under the question and saying this whole premise is illogical. So here's the challenge in going back to the question that the viewer asked quite a while ago. This is one of the challenges, the difficulties in fighting all prejudice, prejudge, it's not factual, and in fighting anti-Semitism specifically. How do you fight something? How do you fight it smart? How do you fight it efficaciously? You can throw things at it, but how do you fight it so that you're going to achieve your goal without giving it the gravitas it doesn't deserve? And the final point I want to make on that is you don't want to get into a shooting match, or use whatever term you want to use, with the anti-Semite. Most anti-Semites, as is the case with most, you know, someone who's going to go paint that on the wall of a synagogue in Huntsville, Alabama, in the slide we just saw, they're not the ones you're trying to reach. Just like when I did my work on Holocaust denial, it wasn't deniers whose minds I was trying to change, because they're so trapped in this pseudo belief, in this fantastic as in fantasy story. It was the people they are trying to influence. Those are the people you want to get at. The people at the edges are moving towards the center. The people in the center, some of them will leave. We have stories of that. We know people like that who have suddenly been exposed to the light, seen the light, et cetera, et cetera. But it's my way of saying it's a very hard task, but it's something we have to do and continue to do. And it's one of the reasons I wrote my book. I wrote my book as a series of letters, as you know, Edna.
Deborah, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, because apparently some viewers are experiencing interruptions in watching the show. If you're having that problem, please refresh your Facebook feed to resume the program. And I also want to reassure you, let you know that this program will be posted later to watch on demand, both here and on YouTube. So we hope you will share it. If you came in the middle, you can watch from the beginning, and you can also share it with friends, both from here and from YouTube later. But if you're having trouble now, please refresh.
It's always good to refresh.
Yes. Speaking of interruptions, Deborah, one of the new ways that anti-Semites and deniers are expressing themselves recently is through Zoom bombing.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? Explain what it is for people who don't know and how that's being used.
Well, in the middle of a Zoom session, suddenly you will get, here's some articles about it, suddenly you will get pictures of Nazis, you will get anti-Semitic slogans, you will get a person live taking over the screen and engaging in the worst kind of anti-Semitic vitriol. Sometimes really, some of it is often gross, just plain gross, but it has expanded. Zoom apparently is doing something about it. I urge viewers whose organizations, religious groups, social groups, whatever, if you're doing a Zoom session to take precautions against it. But it's just, here you have people who are crazy for this. They live for this, looking for every way in which they can make themselves felt in the most obnoxious of ways.
And I think also from a practical standpoint for the viewer who asked what to do about it, there are two strategies that I use and that I recommend. One is to flag it when you see it, to mark it, because it matters. And often trolls use false accounts so that they can comment many different ways. So when you flag it as offensive or violating terms of service, it makes it harder. And the second goes to Deborah's point about people on the margins. In times like this, when the world feels so uncertain and at times out of control, all of us are more susceptible to dangerous ideas, to simplistic answers to complex questions. And so I think, calling out what might seem like a harmless joke, a harmless anti-Semitic joke from your uncle, or a racist meme that someone sends around that you find offensive, but you don't really want to engage, shut that stuff down.
So well said, Edna. Perfectly said, and I should have added it, but I'm glad you're saying it. Absolutely. First of all, flag it. Some of these social media platforms have been less than encouraging in their reaction to this material. I go to Facebook saying, well, everybody's allowed to, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg, in fact, who said it, everybody's allowed to have their opinion. And Holocaust denial Holocaust denial is not an opinion, it's a pornographic history. But flag it, let them know, and show the facts. And the point is that obviously it's a significant fight, and people who are listening to this have tuned in to learn about it. But you got to do your homework. You got to know your facts. Sometimes you aren't quite sure how to answer it, and you want to say, "Oh, you idiot." Nobody ever changed their mind because they were told they're stupid or they're an idiot. What you want to do is be informed. Or go to a site which can, such as the museum site, such as a defense organization, a human rights organization, which addresses these kind of things. Not enough of them do. And figure out, how do I respond to this? As opposed to just, getting angry. Don't get mad, I don't know how, whatever it is, but, get revenge, not revenge, but respond in an efficacious fashion.
Well, thank you, Deborah, for sharing so many thoughts on this. I also know that I speak for you when, and I'm presuming to speak for you, but when I say that also when we are talking about this subject and the way that Jews are being blamed or dragged into this, that we want to be sure to acknowledge that it is not just the Jews, that in fact other groups, and particularly Asian Americans, are feeling very vulnerable right now, physically vulnerable in addition to hate speech, and that it is all part and parcel of the same approach.
If I can add something there, it's not only part and parcel. And if you're concerned about anti-Semitism, then you got to be concerned about, well, today we're seeing anti-Asianism, or whatever the word you want to use, where, Koreans are being attacked, Korean Americans are being attacked, or other groups. That doesn't make it all right to it at all, but it's absurd. I'm just showing its absurdity. But you got to be concerned. You got to be concerned, A, because it's wrong. And it's just simply morally wrong. B, these are Americans, just like, these as any of the rest of us are. But B, you also have to be concerned because if you hate prejudice, any form of prejudice, and I'm assuming that people listening are particularly concerned about anti-Semitism, this doesn't stay put. We used to say it may start with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews, and that still is the case. But in this case, they're attacking Asians. The next, don't ever say, well, it's my ox is not being gored. You know, I'm not being flayed with this. It's okay. A, it's wrong. B, that's on a moral level, and you fight it there. But if you strategically know that prejudice never stays put. Prejudice never stays with one group. It spreads. So if you're concerned about one particular kind of prejudice, be concerned about all of them. Because if it hasn't reached your group yet, just you wait. Just you wait.
Well, on that not uplifting, but cautionary and true point, I'd like to thank you. Thank you, Deborah Lipstadt, for joining us today. Thank you to our viewers all around the world for joining us on Facebook Live. We hope you will tune in again next Wednesday, May 6th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time in the US for our next program about teaching during extraordinary times, both historically and today. And again, this show will be available for sharing, for viewing here on Facebook and on YouTube later. Take care, stay healthy, be safe, everybody. Bye-bye.